Poor Teferi was having one of the worst days of his life. It had started out so well. He wanted to find out what Jhoira's secret was. Why was she sneaking out of the school late at night? He figured if he could learn those secrets, he could use it somehow to work his way into Jhoira's heart. So he followed her late one night and actually managed to succeed in determining what her secret was. Now, unfortunately for him, it turned out the secret was another man. There was a castaway tucked away on the island, and she had her own little, essentially, romantic hideaway with him. Teferi was heartbroken, realizing there was absolutely no way that he could use this secret information to his advantage, because if he brought it up, Jhoira would despise him. So, sulking, Teferi turned around and headed back towards the school. And he made a certain amount of progress before all of a sudden hands roughly grabbed him from behind and slammed him into the ground. There was a truly fearful moment for Teferi where he thought maybe he had been caught by the individual he had saw hanging out with Jhoira, but it turned out to actually be the guards of the Teferi Academy. And boy, were they angry. The guards, they kept Teferi for hours and hours, making all kinds of threats and demands to him. Now, the guards were this angry because as Jhoira had been sneaking out each night, she had been releasing these little artificial birds that would harass and harry the guards. And there had been rules made about how students weren't allowed to create these birds, but the guards never had anyone to pin this on. So Teferi was the first opportunity they had to make anybody own up for basically what they considered sins against them, and they weren't willing to let that go lightly. So for hours and hours, they laid into Teferi, trying every technique they could, verbally, obviously. As guards, they're not allowed to, like, physically harm the students, right? But they are working a very stressful job. Understand that the Teferi Academy is run by Master Malzra, who is a very powerful mage, at least in the eyes of the people in the academy. In reality, Master Malzra is actually Urza the Planeswalker, a being with the powers of a god. At this time in Magic the Gathering history, in the timeline, Planeswalkers were still godlike beings. Now, the events of what happened in the story end up leading to that being a different story later on, but just understand that at this time, the Teferi Academy is run by a godlike being Urza under the guise of Malzra, and he is the one who is in charge of these guards. So the guards obviously have been given very strict rules to abide by. So after hours and hours of Teferi kind of smirking at them, knowing, I mean, remember, Teferi's an arrogant kid. He knows that he's a powerful prodigy. He knows he's a high-ranking student and that these guards can't do anything to him or whatever. So he's sitting there with a little smirk on his face that drained away into dread when he realized that they were actually going to turn him over to Master Malzra. So the guards happily escorted a Teferi who was kind of slumped down, just, oh, please don't take me over there style, as they took him over to Malzra, dropped him off in the custody of Malzra. Barrin was there as well, big surprise. I mean, Barrin, being the head mage of the academy, is going to be there for this sort of scenario. Now, Teferi originally thought he'd be able to give some glib responses to Malzra and talk his way out of this. He expected for there to be a problem, but he was fundamentally unprepared for the level of Malzra's rage. Malzra's face was contorted into anger, and he was rapid-firing accusations at Teferi at a blinding pace, and saying concepts and words that Teferi was not familiar with at all. He said that Teferi must be a Phyrexian spy, but the thing, Teferi had never even heard that word. He tried to say it back, Phyrexian, something along those lines, and Malzra lost it on him, just basically assuming that Teferi was mocking him. But at the same time, Malzra says, I can't smell any scent of glistening oil on you, because anything that's stained by Phyrexia will have that scent of the Phyrexian oil. It infuses everything. So Malzra was almost positive that Teferi was a Phyrexian spy. But due to the fact that Teferi couldn't really pronounce the word after he realized that Teferi wasn't playing around, and the fact that he couldn't smell Phyrexian oil, he stepped it back a little bit. But Teferi's act of innocence, because to Malzra's opinion, that's what it was, Teferi's act of innocence and inability to say words like Phyrexian just ended up infuriating Malzra further. Now, Teferi, with the indignant rage of somebody who has been accused of something they didn't do, he summoned up his courage and he stared directly and defiantly into Malzra's eyes. Remember, Malzra is a godlike being. So Teferi screws his courage up and stares directly into Malzra's eyes and yells right in his face, "You're mad, Master. Everyone knows it. You're a genius with endless arcane knowledge, but you are insane. Illusions, conspiracy, spies, no one wants to come here. In fact, many wish to leave the Teferi Academy, me amongst them." There was a sudden knock at the door. Malzra's eyes locked on Teferi and intensified. All of a sudden, he could feel it felt like a movement inside his mind. He literally could feel a presence inside his mind that solidified itself as a serpent. And Teferi instinctively knew, he could feel that there was this bond between him and Malzra. At the moment that Malzra fastened his eyes directly on Teferi at the knock of the door, there was this feeling of a communal spark between them. There was some sort of kinship that lay between Teferi and Malzra that Teferi didn't quite understand. But as he's gaining this understanding of what's going on, the connection between them, he feels Malzra coalescing into a serpent, a snake in his mind. He could feel the sleek scales of the serpent sliding through his memories. And one by one, it started to devour his thoughts. It started to eat the thoughts with his most present ones of what was going on now, but it started progressively making its way back further and further, devouring more and more thoughts, eating his fear and his insecurity, and burrowing deeper and deeper towards the truth of what happened, why Teferi was outside of the school. Now, this is where Teferi's desire to protect Jhoira caused him to focus his mental energy on what was going on, and he was able to manifest that into his own spirit being inside his mind to contest Malzra. Now, he manifested as a cat that prowled through his mind and leapt on the serpent. Now, these two mental avatars, Urza and Teferi, because Teferi, if you didn't know this, he also has a Planeswalker spark and also has godlike power. He has not fully realized it or learned how to tap into it, anything like that, but he does have that latent power within him. So the two avatars of these godlike beings are battling it out in Teferi's mind, just ripping chunks out of each other. And then abruptly, just out of nowhere, it felt like to Teferi, Malzra was gone from his mind. And at that point, Teferi kind of recalibrated on the room he was in because he was so focused, he didn't really see what was going on. And he noticed that Jhoira and Karn had arrived. And Jhoira basically was there to confess. She said that she had come to confess to Master Malzra. So she explained that she was actually the reason that Teferi was outside the school. Teferi was blown away by this, surprised that Jhoira would actually go to the lengths to expose herself in this way. And then he realized that she's probably just doing this because she's concerned I'm going to tattle on her. And because obviously, again, he's really into Jhoira. So he wants to defend her. So she said she was the reason that he was outside the school walls. But before she could say anything further, basically, Teferi jumped in and said, she dared me. I've always wanted to be with her. She tells me that I'm too young, I'm not brave, I've never done anything worthwhile, and she'd never accept me unless I did something to prove myself. Now, at this point, Jhoira tried to stammer out disagreement and say that wasn't what happened at all. but Malzra just kind of strode over her and basically said, wait, you think you sneaking out of the school at night makes you look good in her eyes? You like literally that's what you think is going to make it happen. And Teferi at that point just decides to lean in with an outlandish lie. He starts talking about how he went out to try and catch a night loon, and how if he caught one of these mystical rare birds, he could present it to her as a gift, right? So at this point, Barrin actually interjects in the conversation and says, wait, what are you went out for a night loon. What are you talking about? Now, because it wasn't Master Malzra that was speaking up, Teferi felt a little emboldened because he had dealt with Barrin on a number of occasions, and Barrin had always been like kind of angry, and in a way it seemed like Barrin wanted to expel him, but he knew that Urza would never let it happen. So the fact that it was Barrin who didn't believe what Teferi was saying made Teferi a little more bold with his lie. So he basically plowed forwards with the lie, going to the point of even describing that he had tiny little chains and a tiny little collar that he was going to use to ensnare the bird to give as a gift to Jhoira. But unfortunately, the little chains that he had were knocked out of his pocket when the guards slammed him into the ground. So Teferi could tell that he had pushed it too hard at that point when Barrin turned to Malzra and said, you know, we should lift the school's ban on mind probes, because normally, under normal circumstances, mind probing magic is not allowed at the Tolarian Academy. So Barrin suggests, you know what, let me cast a truth spell on Teferi, and we will learn really what happened. And at that point, Malzra shared a guilty look with Teferi, and that was because Urza had just decided, you know what, I'm diving into his mind, I don't care. He had already broken the mind probe rules, but he didn't want to admit that because Malzra has a bit of an ego, right? And he doesn't want to admit when he's wrong. So at that point, Malzra goes, no, you know what? That won't be necessary. The only night loon out there tonight was Teferi, and it was a foolish errand that he will never repeat, right? And basically, Teferi knew what was expected of him at that point. So he made a show of gulping and bowing his head. Yes, sir, he said meekly. Malzra turned to Jhoira and asked, were you impressed by this foolishness? And Jhoira, with a surprised look on her face, said, in a way, yes. And Teferi, with his head bowed down, smiled a little smile to himself. All right, my friends, thus ends this installment of the Teferi lore. I thought instead of leaving you automatically on a cliffhanger, I might leave you on a nice little triumphant note where we see Teferi, you know, being a little bit of a good guy. Hopefully you enjoyed it. This channel is fan funded, so if you would like to see more lore videos, then hop on my Patreon. That's the best way to ensure that you get more of the lore goodness. Thanks for coming by, everybody. Like, comment, and subscribe if you want to. Sharing the video around will really help the channel as well. That goes a long way. So again, thanks for coming by, and I'll see you all very soon.